Michael, you wrote a very interesting article for The Athletic this week discussing how the unique nature of this draft will prevent teams from forming biases about players. How prevalent are biases within a draft room, and how might things be different this year?
Well, I think biases are part of all our decision making, right? I think we start with something in mind, a conversation with somebody. This guy's a good player. This guy's a bad player, and we let those words kind of impact us as we move forward. We then collect data to support kind of our bias, and there's all sorts of bias that we deal with. And I think when you have too much interaction with people, we want to have conversations, we want to have deliberation, but we don't want to have groupthink. And sometimes by having too many meetings, you end up with groupthink. And I think that this draft, where everybody's apart, no one's really working in the room, no one can really kind of know what the other person is doing, it may help eliminate some internal biases that teams have.
Could this be a good thing then? Because it seems like the dynamic at the moment is this is going to be a challenge for NFL teams. There's going to be all sorts of problems, but could there be some positives too then?
Oh, I think so. I think it'll help with the bias. I mean, look, let's be honest. Since 2002, there have been 58 quarterbacks drafted in the first round. 58. Okay, and of those, 10 are really legitimate starters. So we know the draft as a whole to find great players is hard. We know this, and when you add bias into decision making, it becomes even harder. The other factor is all those. I think it's 54 quarterbacks. All those 54 quarterbacks that came out in the first round, all of them were can't miss prospects according to most draft experts. Right? No one thought they could miss, and yet almost 28 of them rarely even played in the NFL.
How is this going to impact players as well? For example, you've talked a bit about Tua Tagovailoa recently. How can a team in these circumstances draft a quarterback early, then guarantee him $30 million? He's got a serious injury. He's got injury history as well. But you can't have your doctors check on him. So how is this going to impact players?
I think it's going to impact a great deal. Look, the question that you can't ask about Tua is he healthy? Because the answer to that question can be yes. The question you must ask is, can he maintain health? Is he going to be healthy enough to play? Passing a physical is one thing. Being able to play is another. And I think that's where it gets tied up. Whether it's been the wrist, the ankle, the knee, the hip. He's had a lot of injuries and not a lot of playing time. And I know I said this on my podcast, the GM Shuffle today. I know one team in the top 10 failed him on the physical, and I know another team outside the top 10 that have failed him on the physical because the risk far outweighs the gain. Look, he's a fabulous player. There's no denying his ability. But durability has to concern you.
So what can teams do then? Do they just have to decide whether to gamble? Because there will be players in this draft who could change a franchise or fill a really big need, but you're not going to know whether they can maybe even play for you.
Well, you got to manage your risk reward, right? I mean, when you're picking the third pick overall, the second pick in the draft, and you know how much that cost, that's a certain risk. How much the reward you're willing to take, how much of the risk. As it moves down in the draft. I mean, if you're the Miami Dolphins and you're sitting there at 5, do you risk this pick that you take him? Or do you just say, look, we recognize he's a good player. We just don't think he's going to stay healthy. Pick a really good starting left tackle that'll play 10 years in the league and then move on with your life. I think there's going to be a lot of teams when push comes to shove are going to want to do that.
I spoke to Scott McLuhan earlier and he felt the draft should have been delayed. I suppose the other side of that is how long do you delay it for? Do you have a view on whether it should have stayed in late April or moved to a different time?
Look, I think certainly we're going to be missing information, but I'm old enough to know that there was a lot of times in the 80s we didn't have all the information. And I think it's really about teams, how much work they've done. I mean, this draft started probably 10 days after last year's draft. People start working on it. That's a lot of time to get ready. Now, we don't have the medical, which is a concerning, and what it's going to hurt are guys that weren't at the combine. But at some point, we're going to need to have a draft. It's better now than ever because there's no way we're going to be a country, unlike where you are, perhaps, where we're going to be able to fly around sometime soon. We need to get this draft moving, and we need to build towards building a football team. So I think it's an obstacle, but in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity, and I think there is opportunity.
Have you got any thoughts on the suggestion doing the rounds to essentially extend the draft by a few rounds to try and ease the burden on undrafted free agency?
I love that idea. I don't think it'll fly because I think what happens is a lot of times the guys that don't get drafted end up getting more money than they would if they got drafted. So that becomes a problem. I love the idea. I don't think the union will love it as much as I do.
From what you've seen and what you've heard about the 2020 draft, what do you make of this class?
Well, like any draft, I think the one thing I think fans have to understand, the draft is never about your current team. It's about the next year's team, the 2021 team. You'll get some guys that can contribute this year, there's no doubt. But you got to get guys that'll come in and be able to really make an impact on your team down the road in 20, 21, 22, and 23. There's a lot of good players in the draft. You don't need to make every team happy. You just got to make yourself. So all drafts are relatively the same. And I think what you've got to do is eliminate bias, make sure you minimize your risk, and draft players, especially early, that you can't sign in free agency. You got to draft offensive linemen. You got to draft defensive linemen because they're not out there available for you.
When you were making decisions, Michael, in draft rooms, how did you balance out, we've got a really big need at this position versus this is the best player on the board, he's better than everybody else. What's the thought process there in your opinion?
Well, there's two boards. People don't always understand this. There are two boards in a draft room. There's the horizontal board, which are all the players at all the positions. Then there's the vertical board, which are the players at their own positions. And you've got to pay a close attention to the horizontal board. That board controls the future of your franchise. If you don't pay attention to the horizontal board and you just pay attention to the vertical board, the horizontal board compares all the players who have played all the different positions. And there's only 2 or 3 people probably within an organization that could say player Y is better than player X, even though player X plays tight end and player Y plays defensive back. Somebody's got to be able to see that and make that comparison. And the grade's got to be reflective. So there's 2 boards you really got to pay attention to. And if you're really being honest with yourself without bias, you're going to make sure the decision is easy for you. You take the horizontal board player.
If you're listening to this, you need to do 3 things. You need to check out the GM Shuffle podcast. Go and do that. The Athletic. I have subscribed to The Athletic, and Michael's work is fantastic. It's a great read on there. Go and do that too. And also check out the Daily_Coach as well. We are speaking to Michael Lombardi. I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the Seahawks as well, Michael. What is your view on where they currently stand?
Well, I think there's a couple concerns for Seattle. First of all, I think they're a dynamic team. I mean, I really wish they would change what they did offensively in terms of letting Russell be more of a guy that can take over the game. I mean, Seattle in their heyday was really one of the best fourth quarter teams in football. They've always played games tight, get the game to the fourth quarter and dominate. Last year, they were 19th in the National Football League in fourth quarter point differential. Typically, they're better than that. And their defensive front has to dominate games, and I'm not sure that they've been able to do that of late. When they were in their heyday with the defense that they had, that front was dynamic, and they could take over games. Today, that front isn't as dynamic, nor is the dynamicness of the scheme. What we've seen with the Pete Carroll scheme is we've seen teams like, Jacksonville, the Chargers. We've seen teams that haven't been able to really run it effectively, Atlanta. People have learned how to attack it. So for Seattle, to me, they've got to be more multidimensional on defense. They've got to let Wilson kind of throw the ball. The West Coast offense is really about this. It's about we are going to throw to get the lead and run to keep the lead. We're going to control the ball for the first half, get a lead at halftime, and then put the game away in the second half. That's what Seattle needs to let Wilson do. They've done a good job of repairing their offensive line. They've got enough talent that they can do that. I think they need to be a little bit more carefree in what their approach is in terms of how, because their defense can't just stop people automatically.
What do you make of this whole Jadeveon Clowney stalemate?
Well, I think it's probably benefits Seattle. Look, Clowney can't practice on Wednesday. He can't practice on Thursday. He barely practices on Friday. He misses games. If somebody's like that, you're going to give $17 million to. You're not going to get 16 games, 60 minutes. It's a waste of money. Is he a great player? No doubt. He's a really good player. Would he make them better? Yeah, but the problem is he's not on the field all the time. So again, there's a high risk when you give him all that money. I think they know him better than anybody. Houston knows him better than anybody. Houston gave him away. Houston knew the problems with his injury. Houston understood that he couldn't practice. Seattle learned it. Now they understand it. The reason he wants so much money is because he knows he's a great player. However, great players have to play all the time.
And if it's not him, I suppose the follow-up question is, I mean, how do they go about solving the pass rush? Do they trade for Ngakoue, sign Everson Griffin? Are there players available out there that perhaps us, the fans, wouldn't imagine would be available? I mean, what are the options, do you think?
Oh, I think Everson Griffin would be a great signing if they could get him. I mean, they got to get Collier, their first-round pick, to play better than he did last year, right? They got to get him to come back and really make a difference. And then there's always the draft. And I think they've got to spend a lot of time and resources on trying to find that. They need an inside player as well. Remember, when they were really good, they had a three technique. When you go back and study Pete Carroll's defense, going all the way back to Minnesota, when he was a linebacker coach there or the secondary coach, there was always dominating three techniques. They need Jarrett Reed's a really good player. He needs to be dominating. He missed the games last year. That's going to be the key. They've got to get inside pressure. You get inside pressure with that defense, it makes it better.
What's a trade market typically like 2 weeks before a draft? Is there much talking going on?
Everybody's bluffing now. It's all bluffs. Everybody really, like anything, fear does the work of reason. So as time gets closer, people become more realistic.
Final question. How difficult is it to go from being a good team to a great team? And the Seahawks have been good for a long time, but since the Super Bowl lost to New England, they've always been a wild card, divisional round type of team in the playoffs. How do you go from good to great? How much of a challenge is that?
I think if they shift what they do offensively, look, they're 6 inches away from having the home field advantage throughout the playoffs. If they let Russell throw it more and don't be as conservative offensively and let him take over the game a little bit earlier in the game, and then they add some pieces to their defense, they can get great in a hurry.
I remind everybody, GM Shuffle podcast, check out Michael Lombardi on The Athletic and also check out the Daily_Coach. Michael, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.